In our last lesson, we gave you a brief summary of Mormon beliefs and Mormon cultural life. And what we want to do in this lesson is explore a little bit about how Mormons relate to non-Mormons. But as we begin, the first thing I want you to understand is that not all Mormons are the same. Now, in this series, we're talking about general identifiable traits of Mormonism that are most often accurate and apply to most Latter-day Saints. But remember what we said in Lesson 1, that we want to interact with people as individuals, not in terms of stereotypes. So we understand there is a certain amount of variation within Mormonism. For example, not every Latter-day Saint believes everything that the Mormon Church teaches. There's a lot of room for differences of opinion about a lot of different matters. And so you're going to find people who might disagree about things within Mormonism. And secondly, you're going to find there's different levels of loyalty to the Mormon Church and different levels of personal identification with it. You might have people who are not really active and not really practicing Mormons at all, but they're very identified with it as their culture. Or you might find people who are active and they go every week, but they don't really have a strong sense of loyalty to it. And so there's different levels in which people are assimilated into LDS culture. Some are on kind of the fringe of the culture, some are right at the heart of the culture. There's also regional differences. People practice Mormonism a little bit differently outside of Utah than they do inside of Utah. And there's often generational differences. People who have grown up in the church for decades often see things differently from people who are younger in the church. And there's also differences between converts to Mormonism and people who were born into the LDS church. So we just want you to understand that not all Mormons are alike. And even as we make some general observations about Latter-day Saint culture and behavior. Now, when we talk about how Mormons relate to non-Mormons, the first thing you need to understand is that the LDS Church wants to convert you. You see, Mormonism is driven by a missionary zeal. Their stated purpose is to preach the gospel to the world. That's why they have over 50,000 missionaries serving in 350 regions around the world. And serving a mission is a very important rite of passage to an LDS young person, a young man or a young woman, as a stepping stone into adult maturity, an adult responsibility. And so when they serve a mission, their main goal is to try to convert people to join the Mormon Church. Now, the way they do that is by using a series of lessons or discussions, they're called. And the role of the average LDS member, your neighbor, is to befriend non-members and to encourage them to see the missionaries. If they show an interest, they'll try to enroll you in the missionary lessons with the full-time missionaries. And the goal of those lessons is to bring you to a commitment to where you'll convert to the Mormon Church. And using these methods, they are converting over 300,000 people every year. In fact, this is one of the main contentions between Mormonism and evangelical Christianity, is this idea of conversion, of proselytizing. Because Mormons are very confident and they're very aggressive about seeking to win converts from existing Christian churches. Now, they use what they call a milk before meat approach. That means they don't tell you everything that maybe you need to know. They don't tell you all the details before you make this life-changing conversion experience. They hold back on some things that might be unsavory or things that they don't think you're really going to understand. Like they're not going to tell you that God was once a man or that you could become a god. And the reason that they do that is to remove any obstacle, any impediment from making converts. Their goal is to convert you, to convert people from other churches to join the Mormon Church. Now, related to that, we're also going to see that Mormonism is very sensitive about its public image. You see, Mormons can be very conscious about what outsiders think of them, and they only want to ever present their church in the very best possible light. They don't want to be thought of as weird. They want to be seen as socially acceptable and as mainstream, even though they have their own distinctives that they want to preserve. And so they maintain a carefully crafted public image that's really ultimately designed to help pave the way for conversion. They think if they can maintain this positive image, then more people will be inclined to consider and convert to the LDS Church. Now, another thing I want you to understand, if you don't already, is that living in Utah as a non-Mormon can be very challenging. What I mean by that is that Mormon culture can be very tight-knit and people are very connected with each other. So it almost creates a little balloon or a little bubble, a cocoon that people live in. So for example, they call each other Brother Smith and Sister Jones. By titles of familiarity they don't use to outsiders. And so living in this cocoon, they're not always aware of how outsiders perceive them or how that affects people outside them. And they're not very often aware of the lives of their neighbors who are not living in the cocoon with them. And so that's what I mean when I say that they can be insular. And as a result of that, then, non-Mormons in Utah can often experience isolation. You may be warmly welcomed when you first move into the neighborhood. People will bring you cookies and reach out to you. But in so many cases, that stops when they realize that you're not really a prospect for conversion. They realize that they're not going to be able to convert you, then their attention moves on to someone else. They start paying attention. So non-Mormons in Utah can be ostracized, they can be ignored, they can actually be resented or patronized in some way or another. People just don't enter your life and really want to know what's going on with you. It's tough on kids because in some neighborhoods, kids can really be ostracized, and they reach an age where your kids come home and you hear that they're not allowed to play with little Johnny or little Mary anymore. They're Mormon neighbors. And sometimes in the public schools, the assumption is simply made that everybody's a Mormon. And so decisions are made, policies are set that are really based on Mormon values and Mormon thinking, not really thinking that there might be other people in the school that don't look at it or wouldn't practice it the same way. Now, of course, this is going to vary from neighborhood to neighborhood, community to community. Some neighborhoods have wonderful people that won't treat you that way, but as a whole, you may expect to experience some isolation in Utah. Now, another factor that in terms of how Mormons relate to non-Mormon neighbors in Utah that makes it challenging is that all others outside of Mormons are kind of forced to identify themselves in terms of Mormonism. You see, you're either a Mormon or a non-Mormon or an anti-Mormon or an ex-Mormon. That covers the whole spectrum. But you see, the point is that in using those labels, we're being forced to identify ourselves in terms of Mormonism, not in terms of things that are meaningful to us in our own lives. And so you see, it can be challenging to live in Utah. And in response to these challenges of living as a minority in this religiously dominated culture, we really have three options, three ways that we could respond to the Mormons around us. Our first option is that we could attack Mormonism, and many people have. And that's the framework that many non-Mormons living in Utah take. We try to win the theological battle or try to convince them that they're wrong. But that's not as easy as it might seem, because Mormons are often very well educated in their apologetics. They have answers that make sense to the questions that we might raise. But beyond that, it's not a good idea because Mormonism is driven by a persecution complex. And the more they're opposed, then the stronger they get, the more they resist, and the stronger they feel validated because, after all, the true church has always been persecuted, so they must be true. So we can attack Mormonism, but that's really not a good idea. The second thing we could do is we could agree with Mormonism. But we can't really do that if we're committed to following biblical truth. That's really not an option. So what's third? The third option is that we could do what Jesus would do. And that's what we're going to talk about in our lesson next week. How would Jesus relate to Mormons and Mormonism? We're going to get a clue on that in John chapter 4. So you might want to read John chapter 4 in advance before we meet next time.